And you guys are more than welcome to start popping things in the chat. And we did get one question sent in, so I might start with that. And it's a question regarding planting elm trees. So someone has a property up of Kilnary, I think I'm saying that wrong. And they're looking to plant a bunch of elm trees on 45 hectares that's wooded. And they're asking if there's any like best practices for that, if there's anything they can do to do a good job planting elms.
Sure. Yeah, I guess if you've already got the elms or you're planning on growing them from seed, they are fairly easy to grow from seed. Now, obviously, when you grow elms from seed, you never know which ones are going to turn out to be susceptible to Dutch elm disease. So planting elms is a wonderful thing, but as we know with Dutch elm disease, we can't guarantee they're going to live to be 100 years old. And ecologically, that's okay because they still contribute habitat and all sorts of other important things. So if you do happen to get your hands on the seed, they are shed very early in June. And you can start them in pots. We've actually used historically at the Arboretum just outdoor seed frames, basically made of kind of think of like a raised veggie garden, where spread the seeds on the surface of the soil, rake them in gently, and then cover it with burlap, and then keep the burlap wet. So just kind of hose it down a couple times a day, and that humidity allows the elm seedlings to germinate really quickly. And then you're kind of off to the races. You can pot them up for a year or start transplanting them out. So that's kind of stage one. But once you're planting them out into your property, elms thankfully are quite adaptable. So they can handle relatively dry sites and moist sites, but they generally prefer things a little bit more on the moist side. They're always a little bit happier if they can reach the roots into soil that, like think of riverbanks or kind of depressions that hold water a little bit more in the spring. The one thing to watch out for is once you plant them, they'll grow pretty quick, but that succulent growth is really loved by rodents and deer. So you could plant hundreds of elm trees. They put on a few feet the first year, even more. Everything looks great, and then you come out one day and they're all nibbled down to the ground. So protecting them those first few years is really critical. You can do that in a few different ways. You can wrap individual cages around the trees. So things like hardware cloth you could buy from like a farm store or hardware store. So that's basically just the mesh square grid metal caging that you can wrap around a tree. There are also repellents that you can put on. The one that we use here at the Arboretum is called Plant Skid, and it's available in most garden centers. And it's a blood meal vegetable oil based product that you spray on the plants, and it mimics a predator prey response. So when the deer or the rabbits get up to the tree, it smells like something happened there. And they don't want that kind of danger, so they tend to leave it alone. So those are a couple of things you won't want to look to do, but definitely the first several years. So even the first 3 to 5 years, that's really important to do that, especially in the autumn, to get them through the winter, because in the winter and in this time of year, especially when animals are really hungry, we're coming out of a long winter and there's not a lot popping up yet, so they're looking to eat whatever they can find, and tree bark is sometimes very desirable. So that would probably be the most important thing, is to make sure they're well protected. But otherwise, elms, again, they're really adaptable species. So it really gives you the opportunity to kind of fit them in where they best fit. And ultimately, they can be very large trees if they do survive. So if they do make it to 100 years old, you've got to give them space because they do get quite large. But again, keeping in mind that not all of them will live to maturity because of Dutch elm disease.
Awesome, thank you. Another plant question for you, Sean. In the chat, we have someone who is concerned about their sugar maple. They think it has wilt. Is there anything they can do it? It's about 20 years old.
Okay, yeah, and that's always a little bit of a tricky one to answer without seeing the tree and doing an inspection. So I think the first thing I would say is to if you're really concerned, if depending on where you are, to contact a certified arborist. So if you look in your area, arborists will have a certification that says ISA certification. So that's International Society of Arboriculture. And that means that they've got a little bit more training as far as tree care and looking at diseases like that. If it is a wilt, for example, verticillium wilt, and it's really impacted the tree significantly, like it's right in the system, there's not a lot you can do. And the best way to prevent verticillium wilt is really just to keep the tree stress free as much as possible. But there's not a treatment that you can provide it. Now, that all being said, without seeing the tree and the symptoms, it may not actually be wilt or verticillium wilt. So, so my suggestion would be to reach out to someone who can come do a quick inspection for you, a consulting arborist, and they can actually evaluate it. If there is a part of the tree that's being impacted and the rest of it isn't, what they can do is take a sample and they can go get it tested at a lab to determine if there is actually a pathogen there that is causing it. And if there is a pathogen, then that gives them the strategy to take next. And if it's just, in one branch, in some cases you can prune out the disease portions to prevent it from getting into the rest of the tree, and then theoretically save your tree if you can keep it healthy. But those are the steps you need to look at and kind of build your plan based upon that.
Awesome, thank you. And for those of you that joined us a little bit late, you're welcome to pop your questions in the chat or unmute yourself if you're joining us on Zoom. We didn't have any other questions emailed into us, so I'll very much turn it over to you guys to ask away.
Well, I can ask a question. Oh, let's answer that question first.
All right.
So someone's asking if they should trim their hydrangea in the spring.
Okay, great question. And this is one of those ones that I always, when I get questions about pruning, I always kind of ask the question back: is what you want to try to achieve with the pruning? And I know one of the things we often see in magazine articles is you should prune spring blooming plants after they bloom and summer blooming plants before they bloom. So when I say spring and summer, it would be kind of late April through May would be spring bloomers. And if you prune them before they bloom, then you're losing all the flower buds that were produced on the plant the previous season. Summer blooming plants, which are kind of June into July, August, they produce their flowers on new wood, on new growth that comes out in the year. So it's usually suggested you can prune them before they bloom because they're going to put out new flower buds anyway. Now, that all being said, you don't have to follow those rules. Those rules are strictly in place. They're put in magazines all the time. And I know it's like, oh, I have to prune this time of year, and I have to prune this time of the year, and I can't remember which one, and I'm worried I'm going to harm my plant. With regards to the hydrangea, if you want to improve the shape of it in some way, if there's structural problems, those kind of things, then yeah, certainly you'd kind of look at the reason that you want to prune it, but you don't necessarily need to. If you want to encourage more flowers, then one thing that you could do is this time of year, prune out some of the oldest wood. So when I say oldest, the branches that are maybe looking a little less vigorous, a little more tired, and what that will do is it will force some new vigorous growth. And sometimes when you're looking at the plant, you're trying to imagine where that new growth will come from. It's going to reach towards light in different directions, so you can kind of help train it in the direction that you want. And theoretically, that new vigorous growth, if it's getting everything it needs, sun, everything else, will produce new flower buds this year and potentially more of them. So yes, you could prune the hydrangea this time of year, and that will give it time to put out those new sprouts, which will have new flower buds on them. And more blooms. But that all being said, it's really personal choice. You could never prune your hydrangea again and let it just be wild and free, and that might be okay too. So so yeah, just I guess feel confident as long as you're not taking too much off at once and you're using good, sharp, clean tools. Plants can be pretty resilient, so you can kind of experiment a little bit and then watch how your plant reacts. And then next year, maybe adjust your technique a little bit, determining what the plant does. But that's what to keep in mind when you see those rules in place with spring versus summer flowering. Yeah, you don't have to follow those rules. You can kind of make it work for yourself.
Awesome. A question that just got sent in to me was, someone's wondering, their town just got a lot of trees trimmed using a large machine a few years ago. And now all the trees that have had their branches cut off are dying. So they're looking at different maple, birches, poplar, all the varieties, they're all doing poorly after this. And they're wondering, why would a machine be used to trim branches? And if it does cause problems for the trees, how did it get approved?
Oh, and so I was actually, the very first part of that question, I was reading a question in the chat as you asked the first part. I think you mentioned a machine came by. Was this like a roadside machine?
I imagine it sounds like a
Yeah.
lot. The town just looking to trim a lot of branches
Yeah.
using a big machine, and
Yeah, and the reason why they do that is strictly, I guess, perceived time and efficiency. So in that moment, it's quicker to take a big machine and just mutilate everything than it is to carefully go and prune each tree. Now, in the short term, that seems like you're saving time and money, but in the long term, obviously, if it's causing other problems, you got to go back and fix them or deal with the tree later. So, like anything, trees are pretty resilient when they're healthy. They have to be because they handle ice storms and they handle damage from all sorts of other things. So it doesn't mean that the tree is absolutely going to get infected and die. But when you have those mutilated ends on branches, certainly it is a stress on the tree. It doesn't look great. It is an area where infection can get in. And yeah, trees are going to react poorly to that, especially in the short term. They might recover just fine over the years. But yeah, there's really no good reason except for, as I said, it's quicker to go, and it's basically like a lawnmower that's vertical. It just goes along the side and cuts things. And it is just quicker and cheaper to do that roadside pruning, sometimes for hydro lines and things like that too. As far as how to fix those trees, the first thing, not doing it would be great. The second thing is going in, and this is a tricky thing, obviously, on a lot of work, but a trained arborist to go in and carefully make proper pruning cuts on all those branches where you can kind of clean up the damage, leave sharp cuts that will seal up a little bit more efficiently, and that helps prevent disease from getting into the tree. But beyond that, it's again, not overstressing the trees. I know it's hard when it's not your tree, it's a roadside tree, but giving the trees every opportunity they can to be stress-free as possible to recover from that. But it is unfortunate because, again, it's kind of what seems like short-term gain, but you end up paying for it in the end. If those trees die and they don't recover, you've got to deal with it, right? So.
Thank you. Someone's asking, when can you transplant clematis?
Yeah, clematis. Yeah, so that's this time of year is actually great, depending on where you are. I know today we were actually just talking, Brad, Michelle, and I just before we came on about how hard the ground is again this morning, and it sometimes alters our plans for the day. Depending if the ground is hard, it means we can drive places that we won't leave ruts, but we can't plant things as easily. So this time of year, it's always a little bit fickle depending on how cold it was overnight. But generally speaking, the earlier in the season, the better. For transplanting, because they're quite dormant right now. So you're not stressing them any more than necessary. If you wait till the middle of summer, for example, and it's got lots of green succulent growth, and then you pop it out of the ground, it's going to go like poof, and really kind of suffer and wilt. So when they're completely dormant, it's a great time of year. Right now, you just have to sort of play it by ear week to week. You want the ground obviously to be soft enough that you can dig into it. So you don't want to be digging a hole and getting these frosty kind of chunks. Kind of these almost like rocks of soil. You want, nice loose soil. And you also don't want it to be too wet. So you need to let it dry out a little bit so it's not soggy and mud. You want soil that's got good moisture in it, but again, you can transplant that clematis and fill the root ball, the hole in with nice loose quality soil. So whenever that opportunity presents itself, it could be in the next couple of weeks, I would say go for it. So the sooner the better. April generally, late April is pretty good, because the plants really are just barely starting to emerge, but they're still quite dormant. The longer it goes, the more stress you kind of put on the plant. But certainly, into May, you definitely got a bit of a window from here into kind of mid-May before that becomes a real issue.
Fingers crossed that good gardening season comes soon, because I'm also very eager.
Yes.
In the chat, we have a question about a possum. So someone's neighbor caught a possum trying to catch a skunk instead. And the possum seems to be healthy, no frostbite, but they're wondering, are possums ever aggressive if confronted by pet dogs? Do they tend to play possum instead? And are there any benefits / detriments to having possums in the yard? So as far as, do possums usually act aggressively? In my experience, they do tend to go towards that playing possum, where they turn over on their back and really do an awesome job of selling that they are dead. They even emit a very foul odor. They will lay there motionless. That sort of flight or flight kind of turns into, I'm going to pretend to be dead. And they do a very good job of that. Now, I don't want to say that they would never, defend themselves, because they could. Any animal, if provoked, could do something else. But in my experience, they generally aren't super aggressive or looking to start a fight. But you always want to keep your dogs kind of away from wildlife to, if anything, for the safety of themselves, but also the safety of wildlife. In terms of benefits or detriments to having possums in your yard, I don't know of any detriments, but a really nice benefit to them is that they eat ticks. So they have really good grooming habits, and they, especially nowadays when we're more concerned with tick-borne diseases like Lyme disease, possums can do a really good job of, their long kind of straggly hair does a really job of attracting ticks, and then they groom themselves and eat the ticks. So a little bonus if you do see possums in your yard, they may be eating a lot of ticks in your area, which is lovely. It seems to be all the questions in the chat for now. Brad, have we got anything on Facebook?
No, I don't believe we have gotten any. Let me just check again here. Nope. But maybe I can ask the question then. I'm just curious, in the pollen record, has there ever been anything like, I mean, I guess you can't really see like Dutch elm disease or emerald ash borer or anything like that necessarily in the pollen record, but is there anything that would suggest there was a genus of trees like maple or poplar or something that had a disease or an insect affecting it, and how long it took for it to kind of get back to an equilibrium in the species? Because I'm wondering, I mean, hopefully things go well with humans.
Yeah,
and in the next couple hundred years, maybe the elm trees have reached that equilibrium, like with the disease, where there's resistant ones now. Yeah, so I'm just curious if there's any evidence of that in the past.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, one really good example is hemlock. So eastern hemlock that we see around us now. About 4,900 years ago, there was a big crash in the hemlock population, at least based upon pollen records. So, you kind of see a steady level of pollen, in the sediment of rocks and kind of fossilized pollen. And then all of a sudden, just crashed right down. And since 4,900 years ago, that population has steadily been kind of recovering, I guess, to a degree. It's also obviously got a lot of impact stresses on it currently as well. But the interesting thing is that we don't know officially what that was. I mean, it was fairly broad spread around across the range of hemlock. So it suggests that it very well could have been an insect or a disease. Certainly could be environmental impact as well. But yeah, what's happened since, obviously a lot of those hemlocks were lost, but one theory is that those survivors that remained, and whether those survivors were lucky or isolated, or whether they were genetically tolerant of whatever that pest or disease may have been, eventually over time, they kind of reconnect, spread their pollen, share their genes, that population kind of recovers and grows and strengthens over time. And that's nature's survival strategy. So that actually ties right into elms, and certainly the Elm Recovery Project work at the Arboretum, where it's really looking at trees that seem to have a natural tolerance to Dutch elm disease and giving them the chance to share that pollen and basically maintain that genetic diversity that's so critical in nature, and bringing them together. So it was kind of joked around as a dating service for lonely elms, because it was trying to bridge the gap. Elms that are sometimes not even that far apart, even a kilometer apart. If you imagine, even if they can shed pollen that far, but every single seedling is popping up in a cornfield that gets plowed every year, or obviously in an urban neighborhood where they don't have that opportunity to mature, then the next generation isn't kind of recovering like we might have seen hemlocks recovering over 4,000 years. So absolutely, that's a really good example there with the hemlock. Some other ones that are kind of interesting that are actually sort of, different context is there was a big ice sheet above us 12,000 years ago. And before that ice sheet, there are things like cucumber tree, which is an endangered tree here in Canada, just about 280 trees in southwestern Ontario. But they used to be as broad spread as Alberta. So they were actually much more widespread. There was sassafras growing on Manitoulin Island. And they all got kind of pushed down when the ice sheet receded down into the southern US. There was kind of these refuge areas where different species survived and then slowly started marching back up. And things like spruces and birch have obviously marched very, very far. They're up in the north, almost at the tundra now, and others have been slower to kind of come up into Canada. But it's really fascinating to kind of look at trees and species in that kind of long-term ecological timeline, because we see things very much in our very, even 100 years seems like a long time to us, but it's really not very long for trees. So yeah, and those are things that we have little tidbits of knowledge in that pollen record, but we don't always know why, and definitely more investigative analysis that can be done.
Sorry I joined late, by the way.
Oh, no problem.
But I wanted to tune in to hear about elms and to see, I have a place in Killarney, I'm from Chicago, and whether or not there were elms that I could plant on my property. I have a bazillion maple and probably other trees, but I'm not sure that I have any elm. And,
okay.
Sure.
And actually, I'm not sure, did you ask a question about elm seedlings over email by chance, or?
That's what led me to you.
Okay.
And to this is, I just reached out to the Arboretum and, and they said, oh, well, we have this thing. And so if you've already covered all that territory, I apologize. And I don't expect you to answer it all again, but that's kind of why I've tuned in. So. Sure.
Well, certainly it was one of the first questions we answered. So I guess it'll be available in the recording, but just in brief, what I'd mentioned was really elms being something that are fairly adaptable to different conditions and sites. You can actually propagate some by yourself if you're able to get seeds, but the big thing is planting them is protecting them the first few years. And that's rabbits and deer love young elm seedlings. So that's really the thing, if you're going to plant some, is to make sure you protect them well until they're big enough to fend for themselves. As far as where to get trees, if you're looking to buy them, there are some nurseries that do offer elm seedlings. And the thing is that they're all, Dutch elm disease is very much a thing that impacts elm trees, and they're great trees to plant still, but they don't always live to be 100 years old. Sometimes it's 15, 20 years, but if you've got a wild space, they still provide a lot of ecological benefits, even if the tree succumbs. So there are some nurseries where you can buy some seedlings. The Arboretum is working on an elm recovery project where our ultimate goal is actually to release seeds to nurseries to grow from our seed orchards that are actually healthy Dutch disease tolerant parents that are sharing pollen with each other and breeding. And even those offspring, there's never a guarantee that every single one of them carries those traits to be long-term survivors, but it's bringing kind of the best parents together and providing the opportunity. So that's kind of coming down the pipe in the future as those elms produce more seed over the years. More seed will be going to nurseries. But yeah, elms people hesitate to plant them because there's never a guarantee they're going to live to be 100. And that all being said, we never have a guarantee any tree is going to live to be 100. Right. But they're fast growing trees. They're really adaptable. Orioles nest in them. There's all sorts of reasons to still plant some. So look into some different native plant nurseries. You can do a Google search. There's a number of them that do sell young elm seedlings. So and all sorts of other things too. You might look at the list and realize you want to plant something else, but it's great.
Well, I got a list. The New York Times had the woman that lives near Ottawa who's written, what is it called? The book, Arboretum America.
Yes, Diana Beresford Kroger.
Yeah. So that led me to her and wanting. I have a place in Killarney.
Right.
And I've got some land, some open land. And so I thought, well, I'd like to plant the trees she thinks I should plant, but I've always had a thing for elm trees. And so that's when I reached out to you all. And, so I'll just Google, you're just saying, just Google elm seedling. Now, is the seedling like a small tree or?
Yeah,
the seed?
A lot of native plant growers, and I'm trying to think of some that are closer to your area, but there's there's a whole bunch of suppliers in Ontario like St. Williams and Grow Wild Native Plants and Native Plants in Claremont and Native Plant Source, and those are all things. If you just Google Native Plants Ontario, the websites will all pop up and you can see what they all have available, and they're generally kind of 1 gallon pot size is something that they typically offer. Sometimes you can get something a little bit bigger, but that's something that's 2-3 feet tall, kind of a small container. And they'll have things, you know, from Killarney, things like red oaks and other species that would be worth considering in that area too.
Right.
But yeah, that's really the key is kind of availability. And then, yeah, once you put them out there, they're really, really desirable and tasty to deer and rabbits and groundhogs and whatever else you might have up there. So it's just making sure you give them some protection those first few years. So.
Well, does it make sense? Do you ever try to grow them inside until they reach a certain level of maturity? I mean, I can build something around the tree to protect, you know, wire this and that, or at least I think I can, but should you raise it?
Yeah, well, growing elms from seed is actually, it's one of the easier species to grow from seed. So if you happen to be, you know, wandering your property every day and looking at the birds and the plants and getting familiar enough with elms that you come across, you'd be looking in kind of early June, which is a different time of year. Most seeds or most trees put out seeds in the fall, but there are some species that shed their seeds in spring. So if you're there in early June, you'll see these little kind of brown seeds hanging on elm trees if you find the elms. And you can collect those seeds and plant them right away. And what I suggested earlier was something as simple as like a raised flower bed. So kind of building a box.
Okay.
You can sprinkle the seeds, broadcast them densely on the soil surface, rake them in really lightly, and then you can cover the surface with burlap and use a hose to wet it down. And just do that, wet it down a couple times a day. And after a couple of weeks, you'll have this carpet of little mini elm seedlings coming up, you know, probably more than you'd ever need. And then once you've got those, you can transplant them in smaller pots, or you can, you know, transplant them and you know, kind of like tomato seedlings or anything else, prick them out, thin them, give them more space. And they grow pretty quick when they're young. So within a year or two, you could transplant them out to wherever you want on your property. But again, they'll get eaten really quickly if you don't protect them. So that's where gauging. But yeah, that's something that you may get a lot of satisfaction out of. I guess if I can recommend a resource, it would be a book that was written by my mentor here at the Arboretum, Henry Koch. It's called Growing Native Trees from Seed. And it's available for purchase online. You might find it in a bookstore, but it was published in 2008. So it's not necessarily on the top shelf of bookstores these days, but it goes into all those native trees, elms especially, and how you can do it yourself, which might be fun.
How do you spell his last name?
Koch, spelled K-O-C-K.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
So sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. That's great. Thank you.
Awesome. Lovely discussion on elm trees. Thank you, Sean.
You're welcome.
Switching over to American hornbeam, do you know if there are places you can buy them in the Guelph area?
Definitely, yeah. So American hornbeam, it goes by a couple other names. So if you're in a garden center, you might see it called musclewood, or you might see it called blue beech. So if you actually go and ask them for American hornbeam, they might not even know what plant you're referring to, but it has those three common names that are you know, used variously in different regions of Eastern North America. The botanical name, and if you've got a pen to write this down, just so you know for sure, is Carpinus caroliniana. So that's C-A-R-P-I-N-U-S, and then caroliniana, just like Carolina, but add an extra I-A-N-A at the end of it. And that's the actual species itself. And yeah, they're not going to be in every garden center, but they're produced at native plant nurseries, but they're also produced by some of the really big wholesale nurseries that supply garden centers. So there's something that even if in your local area, your garden center doesn't have them in stock, they should be able to order one in from you. Anything from a small kind of 1 gallon one to a big one that, you know, we say in a wire basket that you would need a crane to move. So, and yeah, they're fantastic trees. They're very, obviously native throughout this region. They typically grow in kind of rich, moist, kind of sugar maple beech forests, but a fantastic tree. So yeah, Brad, thanks for getting that written down in the chat. But certainly, yeah, you should be able to find one. You don't see it immediately, just ask for it, and I'm sure they can track one down for you.
Awesome. And how deadly do you consider glyphosate farm field runoff to trees?
Oh, I mean, I can't answer that really with any kind of authority, but certainly if it's concentrated runoff that's channeling and pooling right into a root zone, yeah, I mean, it stands to reason there would definitely be an impact there as that leaches in. I mean, certainly herbicide injury is a known thing from herbicide spray from fields, kind of, hitting a hedgerow or impacting trees that way. And you don't, the injury is something that's not necessarily evident right away, but sometimes you can see that later in the season where there's, early on you might see some damage to leaves, but then you'll kind of see some sort of, I don't know, mutated growth tips and things like that where the plant has been impacted. If it's a mature plant, it generally can recover from that. But if it's continuous over and over, it's obviously a stress that compounds, I should say. So again, I don't know of any specific studies, kind of outlining exactly how a runoff during one week of the year, for example, would impact a large sugar maple tree. But it is it's poisonous to plants. So it stands to reason that the more concentrated it is, the more possible it is going to impact a plant negatively.
And it's looking like we've again run through all of our questions in the chat. Doesn't sound like Facebook's been very active today. So I'll do another, call out. If you have any questions you've been holding on to, definitely do pop them in the chat or unmute yourself. Or if we're feeling like we've had all of our questions answered, we could wrap it off at that. But I'll give you guys a couple moments to pop anything else. Oh, what should I feed the sugar maple tree? So I think this is in reference to the maple tree that is potentially having wilt. Is there anything that you could feed it for now?
Yeah, well, I usually don't recommend fertilizing trees unless you really know there's a deficiency, because ultimately trees, the roots spread so far into the area they're growing that the site itself needs to be able to provide what the tree needs. So imagine again a tree growing in nature in its preferred habitat, and keeping trees on life support, for example, for a deficiency is something that isn't always sustainable in the long term. So if the tree is suffering from some sort of nutrient deficiency, and that is again something, as I mentioned with the arborist coming in and actually doing an analysis, whether it's a tissue analysis for a disease, you can also do a tissue analysis of leaves or tissues and see if there's something missing. And if it's something is like a micronutrient that is deficient, then there are supplements that arborists can provide. So that can be, a fertigation injection into the soil so the roots can take it up. In some cases, it can actually be an injection into the tree trunk, which is kind of a quick fix, but you can imagine you're putting a hole in the trunk and you don't want to do that every year. That's a wound that can lead to other problems. So that would be the thing, just kind of making sure that you understand why you're giving it fertilizer, because a general fertilizer from a garden center for trees that is really high in nitrogen, for example, that can cause a nice flush of growth and nice and green, and it looks healthy and fantastic. But that growth is kind of artificial in the sense that it's really soft, it's really susceptible to feeding insects and other diseases. So it can actually be something that looks good, but can actually lead to other problems when you overdo it, especially if you do it at the wrong time of the year. So if you do it too late in the season, and it puts on a flush of growth before the first hard frost, for example. So my baseline is you don't necessarily need to feed a tree. We actually very rarely give any of our trees anything here at the Arboretum. In the nursery, they get compost. Once they go into our collections, there's just a handful of the tens of thousands of trees we have here. Literally, there's only a handful that we give some iron supplementation to. And that's because there are some trees that are from other parts of the province that really just don't like our soil here in Guelph. So I'm thinking of things like American chestnuts and pin oaks, and chestnut oaks, and things that they just can't get enough iron from our soil. So we have sometimes supplemented iron, but we also realize we can only do so much of that for a big tree as well. So kind of baseline is don't fertilize unless you have a really good reason and there's a really good deficiency that you come up with. And otherwise, again, the tree itself, probably the best thing you can do is to make sure, I think you mentioned it's 20 years old, but during the really droughty periods that we have, making sure to give it a periodic drink just to help push it through. Don't overwater, which can lead to other stresses, but yeah, just trying to give it that opportunity to take care of itself as best it can. And that's kind of the ultimate sustainable solution. So.
Awesome. And Sean, you're just on fire here with all the plant questions. I have someone asking, they have 3 blue spruces and they have started to die out in the middle. How does one get an arborist to come and have a look at those trees?
Yeah, I guess, there's a couple things you can do. There's a website, it's the International Society of Arboriculture Ontario chapter. So even just putting that in the Google line, maybe I can actually type that in here, there's a website there, and you can find a link there that allows you to find an arborist in your area. So a certified arborist. So most certified arborists are listed in there, and you can find one that's close by. And sorry, I'm kind of typing that as I say it. And that's probably your best bet. I mean, you can certainly look in the Yellow Pages or do a Google search for your area to find someone that is certified as well. But that at least will kind of get you on the right path. I mean, there's people I would kind of recommend in this area that we know of here, but depending on where you are, it's going to differ. But again, those are the ones that could actually come and look and see what the actual problem is and come up with a proper diagnosis for you.
Awesome. And someone else is asking if there's a way to get some pawpaw pollen from us.
Maybe, yeah. I guess that's something. I guess what I would say is we have a process here. We have user request forms, and they're available on our website. And those are basically we try to make sure that because we want to be able to use things for research purposes and conservation and teaching purposes. If everyone just kind of came and got what they wanted, then obviously we might miss out on some of those opportunities. So I appreciate you asking, because that's exactly what we typically do. But if you go to our website and go to research and user request forms, there's an actual form that you can fill out. It's quite simple, but that goes to our research coordinator, Aaron Fazekas. And then he kind of evaluates those and sets those things up so that if the timing works and we can arrange to get some pollen at that time when they're flowering and obviously fitting it in with our timelines of whatever we're doing that time of year, then absolutely that's something that could very well be possible, and just kind of check in through him in that process and see what is doable this year.
Lovely. And I popped down that link in the chat if you're looking for that, Jill.
Great.
Somebody else is asking, what is the chemical compound used to prevent worm benthic, the birch bark? Oh,
you know what? Yeah, it's not something that we use here, and I haven't personally used it. I know it was banned a while ago, but I think it's called Sevin. So SEVIN, and I'm not even sure if you can find it anymore, but I know that was one that was used to control bronze birch borer historically. And I think it might have been banned, I want to say over 10 years ago now, but that's probably what you're referring to. Yeah, I'm not even sure if it's still available commercially in the US or not, to be honest. It's not something we've been using here, but I think that is probably the product that you're thinking about.
Alrighty. So that looks like all the questions that we have for today. One last final call, I guess. But if Brad and Sean, if you guys don't have anything else to add, then I may just leave it there. Big thank you to everyone and all of your really interesting and thoughtful questions. A huge thank you to Sean and his continued amazing ability to answer all of those questions. And if you're interested in this workshop or other workshops that we offer at the Arboretum, we usually run these every month, and we have loads of interesting upcoming workshops that you could also attend if you visit our workshop page on our website for more info. And I hope you guys all have a lovely rest of your day, and hope to see you maybe next month.
All right. Hey, thanks everybody.
Thank you so much.